In this video, we're going to talk about hot swapping UI. So I have a very simple piece of UI here as a demonstration. We're going to use the binding engine to help us hot swap UI quite easily actually. But let's talk about why do we want to be able to do it and what benefits do we get. Looking at the screen, I've got a default view. I've got a combo box here that helps me select an item. I selected view 1. You can see that the UI has changed and that we've downloaded a view 1 HTML. And then when I do it the second time on view 2, you can see that we download a view 2 HTML. Another thing to note is that when we look at the inspector, we can see that we have an H2 and a hello world. And when we change it to view 1, it changes the content of this perspective element, and when we change it to the default, we have a completely different piece of UI in there. So what does all this mean? Well, first of all, we have a custom element here called perspective element that we use to swap out pieces of UI. And there are various scenarios where I have a component that, depending on the state of that component, I want to completely change the UI that I see. And this allows you to do that. The second thing that it buys you is it only uses the HTML that you need when you need it. So there's no big preloading of all of the UI that you want. When you want to see view 1, it downloads view 1 and shows you that. So if I never go to view 1, I would have never downloaded that resource and I've never incurred the cost. Therefore, hot swapping is really nice from a efficiency perspective. You only have what you want when you want it, and you have the central place where you can completely swap out the UI. And then additionally, the binding still works. So this div here, when we look at the code, you'll actually notice that we're binding to a binding context. They all share the same binding context, and that your normal binding actions still apply regardless of having swapped that UI out completely. So let's go and have a look at the code for this. Just a little bit of groundwork first before we look at the details. I have a toolbar that has a select on it. I'm using the standard binding on this so that when I change a option in the select, the property called selected view is changed. So when I change the combo box, the selected view will either be default, view 1 or view 2. This is important because we're going to be using that value in the perspective element. So the perspective element has a view property that we bind against, and this is the way that you tell the perspective element which one of these items do you want to load. You can also see that we have a data-id here that has the same values, default, view 1 and view 2. So when I change this property to either default, view 1 or view 2, the perspective element will swap out the UI based upon the value that you have defined here on the data-id. The second thing here is you can notice we have a CTX once binding, and we're binding it to a value called context, and this represents our binding context ID that we want to use, and I'll show you how that works later on. So the CTX defines what is the binding context that these guys will use when I swap to them. And then lastly, I have a data folder that I provide. I don't really know where those templates exist. This is also optional. It only applies to when you have templates that you want to use externally. So here we have a templates folder that contains our HTML. And this just gives us a bit of an easier way to define relative to this folder, where will I find my templates. Let's look at the first template here. So first thing to note is that it's a stock standard template. It has a data-id that defines what the view is, and I've got a data-default here to say load this view by default. The second thing is that it has its content inside of it. So there's nothing mysterious about it. It's just a stock standard template as you are used to normally. The other two is a little bit special in the sense that they contain templates of their own. So the binding engine has this feature where you can actually load HTML from other files and inject it into your code, helping you to break up the HTML into smaller logical bits and load them from other resources. Not a great idea if you're using HTTP 1, but you should be using HTTP 2 or higher at this point of time. And since of the streaming functions, a set of bytes is a set of bytes regardless of how many files you'd load it from. In this case, however, it's really useful for us because it enables us to only load the HTML that we need when we need it. So when I change to view 1 here, this will come into play. The binding engine will pick it up and say, oh, hang on, there's a source element on this, which means that I actually want to load this guy's content from this file. And note that it's relative to a folder, and the folder that it's relative to is the folder that we have defined on the perspective element. The second view is exactly the same, it just points to a different file. When we open up those files, you can see here there's not a lot of magic going on. It's just a standard H2 and a div, but that this div actually binds against a property called message. When I open up the view model, you can see that I'm actually putting in some default values in here. The first one is just the view that I want the combo box to load by default, which is in this case default. The second one is that context. And the bindable element and view base has a field on it called data ID, which represents the binding context. When we went to this, we said this CTX must use a particular binding context, and we pointed it to the binding context of our view model. You can point it to other bindable contexts. It doesn't really matter. But in this case, it makes most sense for us to make that the view models. And then I've got this message value that has hello world in it, just to show you that when I have this binding here, that context from that view model is actually pulling through, and this item is being parsed and completely bindable. In summary, the perspective element is a great way to hot swap your UI. You can change the views, and only the information that you want to see is displayed at a time. And then, addition to that, using templates with source attributes on it is a great way with the perspective element to lazy load UI so that you don't have to incur all of that cost at once, which is really great when I've got complex UI and I'm not sure whether a user will or will not actually use that view. So hope you enjoyed the video and using of your perspective elements.